Joining me on set to offer her reflections and her reaction to the suggestion of a New York Times columnist that John Paul is not a saint, I'm joined by a special guest. She's a former presidential speechwriter, a Wall Street Journal columnist, and author of the great book, John Paul the Great, Remembering a Spiritual Father. Would you welcome the delightful Peggy Noonan back to the show? I'm so glad you're here.
It's an honor to be here.
Now, the other night you asked me a question, and I'm going to turn it around on you. You said, why do you love John Paul II, and what do you love about him? I'm turning it on you.
Oh, I loved him because he was a very great pope and a very great man. I was thinking today about one of the sort of magical parts of John Paul is that he followed a pope, Paul VI, who had been through some difficult historical moments,
tortured.
And he was older and he was sad.
Yeah.
And suddenly, and after he left us, suddenly we had this new pope, and he was young and he was vibrant and dazzling. He was an intellectual but not boring.
Right.
He was deep but accessible. He was fun. He was theatrical in the best way of being a good actor but not being a phony. And he was compelling. You could not see him and not look at him and follow him as he went by in a motorcade or visiting New York or wherever. He was deeply magnetic at a time when I think the church needed a new dose of magnetism.
In your book, which is so beautiful and thoughtful and personal, you write, and I don't want to pry, but you write that he brought you to a more serious Catholicism and a deepened belief. How did he impact you? How did he impact others?
Oh, I think he impacted the world, and I was one of those who actually felt part of what he was. Look, this was a man who spoke very deeply and wrote, and he was clear as a bell when he wrote about the nature and mission and meaning of the Catholic Church. And you know, I don't remember anybody quite explaining it to me before, so when I was at a time in my life when I was open to listening, I heard him and he broke through like a clear old bell.
And he came in on time. You heard the bells of St. Peter a minute ago. Maureen Dowd, in a recent column in the New York Times that you took some umbrage with, and too, suggested that, quote, John Paul ain't a saint because of the sex abuse scandal, and her contention is, look, this all went on under his nose, and there is no way he should be named a saint. You would say what?
Well, I would say she is a wonderful writer and a hard-working columnist, and really quite wonderful at what she does, but I think she misunderstood the meaning of John Paul. You cannot, first of all, judge a person by one difficult instance in their life. You have to take the life in its totality. You can forget, because John Paul lived and forced so much history, you can forget, for instance, only one thing. Of 10 things I could say, one thing is that he went to Europe and he said, you think you are under communist subjugation. God doesn't see you that way. God knows who you are. God knows you are a member of the church. And these false boundaries put on you by Soviet map makers are not your boundaries and limits at all. And Poland rose up and thought, my gosh, that's true. That was part of the beginning of the end of a scourge of history called Soviet communism, which had denied religious faith, suppressed it, suppressed the people and their right to speak their minds. Look, if that were the only thing this man had done, that would be pretty darn big. So there was a heck of a lot more than that. The second point I would make is that there is a sort of misconception out there, Cato Byrne is wonderful on this subject, that a saint is a person who has not lived a real human life. A saint lives on a cloud. A saint is perfect. A saint is perfection. A saint is a human being. All saints, they have the most wonderful stories. I love to read about the saints. They have foibles, they have flaws, they have imperfections, they have failures. That very fact that they have all of that human mess and yet go on to live lives of nobility and heroic virtue and heroic courage is so inspiring. Don't think of them as perfect, think of them as people who are showing you you could be that way if you tried harder. So that's the purpose of saints, and they are inspiring. And to me, he's so inspiring I could cry over him.
And the sex abuse thing, should it be considered at all?
Sure.
I mean, it's a smudge,
absolutely.
if not a black mark on the record. It's a smudge, but...
Oh, honey, it's part of history, and it was a mistake and a scandal, and it was other things. I am proud of the church right now for trying, as it has for some time, to be being honest and dealing with it when previously I think a lack of candor and a lack of strictness on it had marked the church. But it's real, but it is part of a picture. It is part of a pointillist portrait that, taken as its whole, is a much bigger and deeper thing.
And you wrote at the time that John Paul had a particular historical view of priests being charged with abuse in his native Poland, and that may have clouded his vision when it came to these charges when they were finally brought to him.
John Paul came on the scene as a young man, but by the end he was an old man. He had grown up in an era of heroic priests who risked their lives to teach children Catholicism under Nazism and then under communism. He knew who priests were. He was proud of them, and he had seen both the Nazis and the communists, which hated the Catholic Church. They knew who to hate. You know, they knew who the good guys were in the drama. So he had seen them both go after the Catholic Church by making unjust and rather sick accusations against Catholic priests. So John Paul, his whole context, I think, for the scandal was they're doing it again. This is enemies of the church are doing this. Look, he was blinded by his own history, but we all are. We're human.
Yeah. Oh, and once he learned the truth, he was enraged. I know that from cardinals who were in that private meeting. He was not a happy camper that day. Let's move on. I want to talk about Cardinal Stanislajiewicz. This is the Pope's personal secretary and friend for more than 40 years. Here he is on that final goodbye that John Paul II issued from this window just over Peggy's shoulder. Take a look.
It was a difficult time, because every shepherd needs his voice, especially for this Pope, who was an actor in a certain sense, which means he worked with his voice. That was a great sacrifice on his part, just to lose his great predilection, his great ability to use the voice. I remember the last blessing at the St. Peter's Square. He really wanted to speak before, and he even made a serious attempt before to speak, but when he went to the window, he could not speak a word. He came back very sad. Then he said to us, if I cannot celebrate in public, that was Easter, if I cannot speak to the people, it might be better for me to die. But then immediately he added, may God's will be done. So he could speak to us with great difficulty, but he could speak. He asked for a piece of paper on which he wrote, never after he came back to this moment of great suffering. I think that these written words, totus tuus, were his last words, the last words he wrote.
You write that he was a victim soul, and he showed us how suffering had meaning.
Yeah, I think the last years of his papacy, when he was so dreadfully ill, when he had the Parkinsonian mask, when his face and head were bloated from the medicines that he took, this was a man who was suffering and who every day went forward and did his very public job while he was suffering. He did not even try to hide it, as if he were telling the world, every life, even the life of one who is old and sick and disabled and can't hold up his head, every life is worthy, is special. No one is expendable. Everyone should live, and we should respect each other no matter what our condition. So I thought it was beautiful, beautiful Christian witness, and a bit of a cross. Nobody asks to be a witness like that.
No.
You know, very few of us say, give me suffering and I will show it to the world.
Tell me about your meeting with him. You met with him here at the Vatican.
I did. I had I was part of a not small private audience, but it was a private one. And I was, you know, this man had been huge to me, and I was awed to meet him. I was awed to touch him. He put those little rosary beads in my hand, and I was just telling Catherine Lopez, I look a little goofy in the pictures that the Vatican is kind enough to take, because I was so awed by him, I could not quite look at him.
Oh,
and
wow.
so he was looking at me and putting I beg your pardon, rosary beads in my hand, and I'm sort of off tilt a little bit. I couldn't look in those eyes.
Wow.
So this was a huge man, and this man was a saint, and it is a privilege for all of us to be here this weekend when Pope Francis will say, yes, he is a saint.
Yeah.
And the people who were out in the street saying Santo Subito when John Paul died, they gave an order, and the church has come through.
You know, there's a funny story you made me think of. When Rebecca and I, my wife Rebecca and I went to see him, we were just married, I don't know, maybe a year before, less than a year. And he came down the line, he looked right past me to her. Forget me, he was looking at her the whole time. And so I got the rosary toss. He went right for Rebecca, and he said, your name? And she said, Rebecca. And he said, Old Testament Rebecca. Every time I saw him for the next 10 years, he would ask me, how is Old Testament Rebecca?
Oh my goodness.
Amazing retention.
Can I make one more point?
Yes.
You mentioned John Paul as a Marian.
Yeah.
He was a Marian. He was the most explicit Marian, Mary-loving Pope of my time, and I think part of it had to do with this man loving and honoring and appreciating women like Rebecca.
Yeah.
And I would love to see more of this in the church. More of this beauty and love and respect for women.
Well, we're going to see it on this show, and you're a part of that.
Thank you,
Peggy, for being here.